program and benefit from an early childhood education in this state. We've also already announced support for the small rural kindergartens that are really struggling to remain viable, and their kinder committees have really onerous fundraising requirements that are placed upon them. So we want to support kindergarten services right across the state so that they are viable and that every child will be able to participate. We have the current COAG arrangements on the 15 hours of kindergarten, which of course was the federal government policy in 2007. Policy that was announced the wrong way around. Normally you assess your capacity to deliver and work towards a timetable of delivering not only trained teachers but also the infrastructure that's needed. And what we saw was a policy announced without doing that planning work first. And the consequences of that at the moment are that there won't be universal access because hundreds of children may miss out on a kindergarten experience in 2013 if we move to 15 hours then. And also we may see the loss of 3-year-old programs. So we've said that we will lobby the federal government for additional investment in infrastructure. We also want to see them fully fund the additional 5 hours so that parents don't have the impost of additional costs in order to cover those 5 hours. And we would like to see the federal government also contribute towards the training of those teachers. But I think what we need is more flexibility in that timeline for delivery. Services that can deliver it now and who are delivering it now, that's terrific. But for services that aren't able to deliver it, we don't want to see hundreds of children miss out on a kindergarten experience. So we need to have some flexibility around the timeline for the implementation of that policy. We will also participate in the COAG process for the National Quality Agenda and continue to take a lead role in the implementation of the National Quality Agenda for early childhood education and care services.
Thank you. Now, the next topic for us is the sustainability of the community sector itself. So, BCOS ran a questionnaire process, and we've had responses from the Labor Party, the Greens, and yourself. I think it was you, Mary, who gave us a thoughtful response and alluded to community services policy to be announced. One of the big ticket items this election for our sector is the commitment from government, which has been matched in media comments by the Coalition to support the national pay case for community service workers by funding the outcomes where state programs are impacted. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure. And we're very conscious that the group that we're talking about through this national pay case is largely women who are underpaid relative to often their public sector equivalents, and across the board their work is not necessarily reflected, the respect for their work is not necessarily reflected in the pay that they take home on a weekly basis. We fully support the pay equity case. We will support the decisions of Fair Work Australia and we'll be passing them through in our funding arrangement. So we're very clear that we believe this needs to happen and that we'll be funding the outcome.
And we've had just the last few days since the Commonwealth Government wrote a submission to Fair Work Australia, which seems to allude to a less than generous approach towards funding the outcomes or towards capacity to pay for the outcomes. So how would a value government deal with these issues, and how would you be able to see building a workforce if we had very constrained outcomes to the national case?
Well, the constrained outcomes would need to come from Fair Work Australia. That's because
right.
we're not, we are going to support that decision. And I do think it was interesting that both the federal party, Labor Party's submission, the federal government submission, was quite qualifying and suggesting that be a very restrained decision. I think the other thing that's been interesting in the last 24 hours is that it's been revealed from the Department of Human Services, their modelling is that the first year cost would be $450 million to support if the full claim in dollars, to support if the full claim is supported. Now John Grubby rejects that, he rejects the modelling and he rejects that decision, saying the $50 million he announced was more than enough and a lot of money, and he expects that to be maintained. So I think there's some real lack of understanding about what the implications may be, and perhaps some equivocation on whether that will actually be delivered. I know yourself and VCOS have said they think it'll be, you'll think it'll be much more than 50 million, and the ASU has, all the unions have said that as well. So I think there's some real concern from the Labor side of things about what's happening. We've been very clear. We will be making financial commitments in our policies in relation to supporting that claim, and if it's more than that, then we will be funding and supporting it. So we don't see any decision, we won't be backing down from supporting that position. I think there's some broader issues for the workforce as well, and most people I talk to, pay is important. It reflects the respect and the importance that we pay to their roles, but there's also a lot about how we retain workforce, how we support them, whether we've got the management structures around them, and particularly I'm thinking that child protection workforce is a good example, where the retention levels are quite high, are very low. 28% of the child protection worker 2, the frontline workers, are leaving every year, and that makes it very hard to deliver really important and critical services on the front line. So I think we need to, and we will be committing to a community sector workforce review, not just narrow in relation to each of the areas, because many people cross between different aspects of the community sector. So we will be taking a look at the community sector workforce as a whole, which will sit nicely, I think, alongside the pay decision, about how we can, what other supports we can put around the workforce, whether it be management, whether it be training, what else can be there to make sure that that workforce is both attractive for students making a decision in terms of their careers, but then they can be successful in those roles, they can see career progression, which is often a big issue as well, they can be trained, they can be supported, and they decide to stay within the system, which highly values the skills that they have.
Thank you. Now we'll be, we've got one more question before we move to the next tape. So in terms of the overall approach of a value government, many VCOS members recall a grim period in the 1990s where the government of that day cut a lot of services and programs. To what extent is the Coalition offering a different approach this time?
Well, I think it's a different circumstance. We are very clearly, and both Ted Baillieu and Kim Wells as Shadow Treasurer have said very clearly we won't be taking on additional debt, we will be leaving a surplus, so there is a buffer, and all our policies are costed in that context. They are absolutely doable, absolutely achievable, and later this week further information will come out with the evidence in relation to all of that. So the world is different from when Jeff Kennett was coming in 1992. We see that these commitments that we're making are high impact, will have achieved the outcomes we want to achieve, are good investments, and are absolutely doable within the budget context. And we won't be cutting there won't be cutbacks to other areas. As we've said, we've committed to retaining the packages that are there in relation to Fairer Victoria and investing on top of them, not walking away. And we believe that things that can be done better are some of the big infrastructure projects, for example. We wouldn't be wasting hundreds of $1 million on a Mikey or overruns of roads and infrastructure and other things. So by managing the money better, we can actually have a much higher impact for everyone and do that in reasonable fiscal constraints and situation.
We do note some big ticket items in coalition policy that would affect state revenue, so things such as stamp duty cuts, also unspecified so far commitments to build new prisons. If funding got tight, what cuts to community services to vulnerable Victorians would you be able to